Good evening, Madam Principal, Honorable Speaker, Professor Somdatta Mondal, participants, colleagues, and students. I am Mohua Basu, the IQAC coordinator of Banipur Mahila Mahavidyalaya, and I welcome you all to this webinar organized by the IQAC and the Department of English, Banipur Mahila Mahavidyalaya. I request Madam Principal, Dr. Vidisha Khosdusthida, to please give the welcome address. Over to you, Madam. Madam, you are muted.
Good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, KOBI RANI Memoirs and Correspondences of Nirmalkumari and Rabindranath. We have Professor Somdatta Mondal amongst us. We are honored to have such an eminent writer and speaker. Now I will say a few words in Bengali because আমার ভালো লাগবে না যদি নির্মল কুমারী ও রবীন্দ্রনাথ সম্পর্ক নিয়ে দু একটি কথা বাংলায় আমি বলতে না পারি। নির্মলকুমারী মহলানবিশ, যাকে আদর করে রানী বলে ডাকা হতো, তিনি ছিলেন প্রখ্যাত ও গোঁড়া ব্রাহ্মনেতা হেরম্বচন্দ্র মৈত্রের কন্যা। ব্রাহ্মণ সমাজের অনুষ্ঠানে তরুণ প্রশান্ত চন্দ্রের সঙ্গে দেখা হলো রানীর, এবং দেখা মাত্র তাঁদের মধ্যে প্রেম জেগে উঠল। তারা স্থির করলেন বিবাহ করবেন, কিন্তু হেরম্বচন্দ্র রাজি নন। তিনি ভয়ানক গোঁড়া। তার গোঁড়ামির গল্প আমরা ছাত্র বয়সে অনেক শুনেছি। যেমন তিনি থিয়েটারকে অপছন্দ করতেন। একদিন হনহন করে হেঁটে যাচ্ছেন কলেজ স্ট্রিটের ফুটপাত দিয়ে, তখন কেউ তাকে জিজ্ঞাসা করেছে, অমুক থিয়েটার হলটি কোথায় আপনি জানেন? উনি খুব রেগেমেগে বলেছেন জানি না। তারপর মনে হয়েছে তো মিথ্যাচার, আসলে উনি জানেন। আবার তিনি ফিরে গেলেন সেই লোকটির কাছে, সেই ব্যক্তির কাছে, বললেন হ্যাঁ আমি জানি কিন্তু বলবো না, থিয়েটার আমি পছন্দ করি না। যাই হোক, এটা মজার গল্প। এহেন হেরম্বচন্দ্রের কন্যা নির্মল কুমারী যখন স্থির করলেন বিবাহ করবেন প্রশান্ত চন্দ্র মহলানবিশকে, তখন হেরম্বচন্দ্র রাজি হলেন না, কিন্তু রাজি হলেন রবীন্দ্রনাথ। এই দুইটি তরুণ হৃদয়ের প্রেম তার কাছে খুবই মূল্যবান বলে মনে হলো। অবশেষে 1923-এর 27শে ফেব্রুয়ারি দুজনে বিবাহ বন্ধনে আবদ্ধ হলেন। পিতা নন, মাতুল যিনি নীলরতন সরকার, ডাক্তার নীলরতন সরকার, তিনি কন্যা সম্প্রদান করলেন। সেই বিবাহ উৎসবে উপস্থিত হয়ে কবি অসামান্য একটি উপহার দিলেন তরুণ দম্পতিকে। তার বসন্ত গীতিনাট্যের খসড়া পাণ্ডুলিপি এবং তার উপর স্বহস্তে তিনি উপহারে একটু কবিতাও লিখে দিলেন। প্রশান্তচন্দ্র মহলানবিশ একজন জগৎবিখ্যাত রাশিবিজ্ঞানী। পরে তিনি ইন্ডিয়ান স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্যাল ইনস্টিটিউট প্রতিষ্ঠা করেন এবং তখনই তাঁর ভুবনজোড়া খ্যাতি। তার সঙ্গে গবেষণা করেছেন একসঙ্গে বিলেতে প্রফেসর রামানুজন, এবং প্রশান্ত চন্দ্রকে তিনি শূন্যের ধারণা সম্পর্কেও বলেছেন। এবার মনে রাখতে হবে, যখন নির্মল কুমারীর সঙ্গে বিয়ে হলো প্রশান্ত চন্দ্রের, তখন প্রশান্ত চন্দ্র তরুণ, কিন্তু তিনি লেখাপড়ার জগৎ নিয়ে এতটাই ব্যস্ত যে তার সংসার বিষয়ে উদাসীনতাই ছিল বলা যায়। নির্মল কুমারী এক হাতে যেমন তাকে সামলেছেন, তাদের সংসারকে সামলেছেন, তেমনি প্রশান্ত চন্দ্রের সূত্রে রবীন্দ্রনাথের সঙ্গে তার সখ্য গাঢ় থেকে গাঢ়তর হয়েছে। সখ্য কথাটা আমি এই জন্য ব্যবহার করলাম, কেননা রবীন্দ্রনাথ অন্তিম শয্যায় তাকে কিন্তু বন্ধু বলেই সম্বোধন করেছেন, যদিও তিনি বয়সে অনেকটাই ছোট। এটাই রবীন্দ্রনাথের বৈশিষ্ট্য। অন্তরের অন্তরঙ্গতায় রানী বা নির্মল কুমারী ছিলেন তার অত্যন্ত কাছের মানুষ। এই যে রবীন্দ্রনাথের সঙ্গে জীবন যুক্ত হয়ে যাওয়া, এর মধ্যে দিয়ে রানীকে আমরা নানান পর্যায়ে বিকশিত হয়ে উঠতে দেখি। তিনি রবীন্দ্রনাথের সহচর, ভ্রমণের সময়, ভ্রমণের বাইরে তিনি তাদের পারিবারিক সুপরিচিত একটি মুখ, প্রায় পারিবারিক মানুষই বলা যায়। রবীন্দ্রনাথের পত্র একটি আশ্চর্য জিনিস। সারা জীবনে তিনি যেসব পত্র লিখেছেন, সেই পত্রগুলিকে একসঙ্গে গ্রথিত করলে একটি 10,000 পাতার বই হতে পারে। এর মধ্যে আশ্চর্য বিষয় হলো এই যে, প্রথমত একটা কথা বলে নেওয়া দরকার যে পত্রগুলিকে দুটো ভাগে আমরা ভাগ করতে পারি। কতগুলি নেহাতি কাজের পত্র, কতগুলি হচ্ছে তার ভেতরের অন্তরঙ্গ মানুষটির পরিচয় বহন করে। এই যে পত্রাবলী, যেগুলি অন্তরঙ্গ পত্র, কাজের পত্র ব্যতীত, সেই পত্রগুলির মধ্যে সবচেয়ে বেশি পত্র তিনি লিখেছেন কিন্তু নির্মল কুমারী মহলানবিশকে, সেটি প্রায় 500। 1923 সাল থেকে আরম্ভ করে 1941 সাল পর্যন্ত তাদের দুজনের মধ্যে পত্রধারা ছিল অবিচ্ছিন্ন, এবং এই পত্র সাহিত্য সেটি বাংলা সাহিত্যের একটি অমূল্য সম্পদ। রবীন্দ্রনাথ অন্যান্য ব্যক্তিকে যে পত্র লিখেছেন তা যেমন অমূল্য সম্পদ, বিশেষত নির্মল কুমারী মহলানবিশকে তিনি যে পত্রাবলী লিখেছেন সেগুলি অত্যন্ত মূল্যবান, এবং তার মধ্যে দিয়ে নানা ধরনের বিষয় আমরা জানতে পারি। ভারতীয় যে দর্শন, সেই দর্শনের গভীর উপলব্ধি, আমাদের দৈনন্দিন জীবনের ছোটখাটো টুকরো বিষয়, উদার প্রকৃতির মধ্যে তার রবীন্দ্রনাথের মন কিভাবে ব্যথিত ব্যাকুল হয়েছে, কখনো আনন্দিত হয়েছে, সেই সব, এবং এর 68টি পত্র বেছে নিয়ে পথে ও পথের প্রান্তের গ্রন্থ, এছাড়াও রবীন্দ্রনাথের সান্নিধ্য নিয়ে কবির সঙ্গে দাক্ষিণাত্যে ও কবির সঙ্গে ইউরোপে এই রকম দুটি গ্রন্থ আমরা সন্ধান পাই। এবারে একটি কথা বলি, 22শে শ্রাবণ বলে নির্মল কুমারীর যে গ্রন্থ, সেটি আমাদের অত্যন্ত আবেগতাড়িত করে। কবির অন্তিম শয্যার ছবি আমরা সেখানে দেখি, কবির শেষ নিঃশ্বাস ত্যাগ, যার মধ্যে কোনো বিকার নেই, বিকৃতি নেই, যেন পরম চিন্তিক সমর্পণ করা সেই রকম। তারপর তাকে বর বেশে সাজানো, তার গলায় লম্বিত রজনীগন্ধার মালা, তার হাত সঙ্গে পড়তে পড়তে আমাদের উঠি আমরা, এবং তিনি সেটাও বলে যে আমার চলে যেতে চাই খুব শান্তিনিকেতনে, যদিও সঙ্গে জানিয়েছেন যে দল লোক শেষ শয্যায় কবির ঘরে ঢুকে পড়ে এবং তারা কবিকে সেই গান করে বন্দে মাতরম এবং রবীন্দ্রনাথ দিতেই ছিল। আজকে শ্রাবণের এই জলধারা নত দিনটিতে আমরা কবিকে স্মরণ করব। শ্রাবণ মাস আমাদের খুব কষ্টের মাস, এই নেই কবি আমাদের ছেড়ে আলোকপাত করব আমাদের দিবস, এই দিনটা দিবসে আপনাদের সকলকে আমি শুভেচ্ছা, অন্তরের অন্তঃস্থল থেকে কৃতজ্ঞ স্বাগত কার্যনির্বাহ
Thank you, madam. A few words before we go into the technical session. This webinar is being telecast live on YouTube. The link for the live telecast has already been posted. You can share it with your friends. And please do not mute the speaker. A request to the participants, please do not mute the speaker when the webinar is in progress. I now request Dr. Shomana Gupta, HOD, Department of English, Banipur, Mahila, Mahavidyalaya, to please take over the technical session.
Thank you, Professor Mahua Basu. Good evening to everybody. Good evening to all of you, and a very warm welcome to the technical session of this webinar. I'm here to introduce Professor Somdatta Mondal. Somdatta Di, as I call her, and most of us hardly needs any introduction to the English fraternity. But since people from all walks of life have joined this webinar, so it is customary to give a brief introduction of her. Professor Somdatta Mondal is retired professor and ex-chairperson of the Department of English, Vishwabharati, Shantiniketan. She graduated from the University of Calcutta and received her MPhil and PhD degrees from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. A recipient of several prestigious fellowships like Fulbright Research and Teaching Fellowships, British Council Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship, Rockefeller Residency at Bellagio, Italy, Salzburg Seminar and Shastri Indo-Canadian Faculty Enrichment Fellowship. She has been published widely, both nationally and internationally. Her publications include 2 volumes, Film and Fiction, Words into Image, which was published in 2005, and Reflections, Refractions and Rejections, Three American Writers and the Celluloid World, which was published in 2002. And her translated volumes are number 1, the present one, KOBI and RANI, Memoirs and Correspondences of Nirmalkumari Mahalanobis and Rabindranath Tagore. It is published this year only. Then there is The Journey of a Bengali Woman to Japan and Other Essays by Horiprabhu Takeda, which was published in 2019. The Popularity of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, a comparative analysis by Shukumari Bhattacharjee, which was jointly translated with Tonika Sharkar and published in 2018. Gleamings of the Road, Pother Sanchoy by Rabindranath Tagore, which was published also in 2018. Crossing Many Seas, Onek Sagar Periye by Chitrita Devi, published in 2018. A Bengali Lady in England by Krishna Bhavini Das, published in 2020. Wanderlust Travels of the Tagore Family, 2014. The Westward Traveller by Durgavati Ghosh, published in 2010. And among her editorial ventures, there are many, which actually cover her areas of interest, which are contemporary fiction, film and culture studies, diaspora studies, and translation. She has received a Sahitya Academy Award for translating short fiction and the Meenakshi Mukherjee Memorial Prize from Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies for the best published research article during 2012 and 2012 to 13. And before going into more details, I would, on a very informal note, I would like to convey my heartfelt gratitude to Somdatta Di for kindly consenting to be the resource person today. And I'm so very happy to have her as my supervisor for my PhD thesis. I'm so very lucky and happy. Thank you, Somdatta Di, from the bottom of my heart. And over to you now, Somdatta Di. We are eagerly waiting to listen from you more about your book. Thank you very much. Somdatta Di, kindly unmute yourself and turn on your video.
Turn off the microphone.
No. Turn
What
on
should
your
I do?
video. You turn on both the microphone and the video.
Turn on camera.
Yes.
The video.
Yes, you are visible.
I'm visible, but I can't see myself. Anyhow.
You are visible and audible to us.
And the microphone is working?
Yes. It's working very well.
It's working? I'm
Yes,
a very much technologically challenged person, so I'm very scared about all these gadgets. Whether I'm not very sure, but shall I begin?
Yes, ma'am. Please begin.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. It is a great pleasure for me to be invited by Banipur Mahila Mahavidyalaya to speak and present a new book which has just been published but which still hasn't seen the proper light of day and release. I am very happy because this platform becomes, due to the COVID pandemic, it took a long time to come out from the press. It was only received last month, a few days ago, and I'm pretty sure that this, apart from your webinar for your college, this gives me the great opportunity to release the book in a web form today. And I hope, so this is an added, feather on my cap that I get an opportunity for your platform to talk about this book. Now, at the very beginning, let me tell you, আমি বাংলাতে বলতে পারলেই বেশি খুশি হতাম, and your principal has already set the right tone, but the first reason for doing this in English is because of a pan-world audience, people, pan-Indian readership who cannot read the original Bangla text. So this was my prime motive for translation. As I did the Pother Sanchay essays, Gleanings of the Road, a couple of years back, my intention is to get access so that people, non-Bengali speaking people, get access to many of the works of Rabindranath. Now, I have been working on women's and memoirs for a long time. As Shumona has already announced, I have already translated several travelogues by women in the colonial era. But what is the most important is the reason when I first entered into this project was actually part of the travel narratives which I was doing. And I was then informed by Shupriya Rai, who was the series editor of Rabindranath and Travelogue in Rabindra Bhavan Archives. She told me that this book, Kobir Sange Europe, is such a seminal text in understanding Rabindranath's travelogues, and till today it has not been translated. This was a couple of years back. So that set me thinking, and that was when I started translating. And as I've been doing this over the last couple of years, and the volume grew in size, I found that one travelogue is not enough. I also included the shorter memoir Kobir Sange Dakhinate, and actually Nirmalkumari has written 3 memoirs, and as your principal has already done a good work, the homework for me, which I thought I would have to tell about a little bit about the biographical details, but she has already provided that. So the 3rd memoir is Baishe Sravon, which actually details day-to-day, notes of the writer for the last 1 year of his life, exactly from August 1940 to August 1941. I have not included that in this anthology which I have done. Let me tell you the reasons why and what I wanted to do. The first reason is because of the big voluminous size, and this book, if you get a chance to see it, it is already 500 pages, excluding Baishe Sravon. So technically it is impossible to include that. Now coming to the actual reality of why Nirmalkumari, as I told you, the reason was to Bengali readers are very familiar with Rabindranath lovers, they all have read, but I want to give you certain incidents which I came across while doing the translation work, and this is very seminal to understand what is what. Now, as I told you, my book, Kobi or Rani, the 2 ways they affectionately addressed each other, so it is Kobi and Rani throughout. So no Nirmalkumari from now, it is Rani. So in the just before a month before Rabindranath died, he had said, "Tumi amar shesh bondhu," one of my last friends. I know even if others go away, you will not leave me. So this was just a month before his death. He had held Rani's hands and said this. So many people claim to be close to the poet, especially serving him in the last days. But this special relationship that the poet shared with Rani Mahalanobis is something which is very interesting. Now, what I have done is, when I went to do this translation, I found something problematic. Problematic in the sense, the books, if you take them according to the chronological order of publication, do not actually follow the years about when it was written. First, what I want to say is, KOBIর সঙ্গে Europe was about the 7-month long trip that Prashanto and Rani accompanied the poet and went to Europe in 1926. I will tell you a little bit a story about this, about why the book was published last as late as 1969. You see, a memoir of 1926 published as late as 1969. And the second, chronologically according to the trips, if you take it, KOBIর সঙ্গে দাক্ষিণাত্যে is a shorter narrative which talks about their trip together to Sri Lanka and South India. And it took place in the year 1928. Okay. And of course, Baishe Shravan was much after, 18 years after the poet died. So this is the sequence of the memoirs. And what is interesting is, Nirmalkumari began to write memoirs. The first memoir was KOBIর সঙ্গে দাক্ষিণাত্যে, and she came to the other later. And what you find when you read all of them together is, there are several times, intertextual references. She is talking about the past, the present, and because of the sequence in order they were written. Now, what I have done in this volume is, I think till today it will be under both covers, the most voluminous collection of Nirmalkumari's works, except Baishe Shravan, in this issue. The first is, I go sequentially. I first translate KOBIর সঙ্গে Europe. The second travelogue, KOBIর সঙ্গে দাক্ষিণাত্যে. And after that, Potrodhara series, the letters called Pothe o Pother Prante, a collection of 60 letters that Rabindranath selected himself among the 500 plus letters he had written to Rani, and which was published in 1938. Now, why I included these letters is also interesting, because at least the first 10 letters have a reference also in KOBIর সঙ্গে Europe. So, there's a continuity which continues. The same incidents, same things go on. So that was this. Apart from this, in the appendix, I have included 3 other essays by Nirmalkumari, which are also very significant. One is called Om Pita Nahoshi, about the Upanishadic prayers as a Brahmo Samaj person. Serious philosophical musings. The second is called Tamosoma Jyotirgamaya. That is a long speech which Nirmalkumari delivered a month later at the Calcutta University after the poet's death. It was originally a lecture delivered at the Calcutta University, and there she brings out the poet's musings on death, on various issues. And he ends with the story which the poet told her about how he coped with his young daughter. She was also called Rani by her. How he took her to Almora when she was sick, and how he coped and brought her back, served him alone, etc. So that essay is also very significant part of this text. So it is not only travelogue. Apart from that, there is the last appendix essay is a short essay which Nirmalkumari wrote for at the request of Anandomala Puja Varshiki for children. Rabindranath ke ছেলে মানে পরিচয় করে দেয়া with young and adolescent readers. So this was published the same year, যেদিন মারা যান, 1941, in the Puja Shankha of Anando Mela, the Puja Varshiki Shankha. So these have also been included. Now let me begin with certain interesting phenomena. Now the relationships and the biographical details which I wanted to begin with has already been very clearly mentioned by your principal, madam, in details. So I am not going to go into that, but I begin. How does the relationship begin? Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobis's relationship with Tagore begins first time when he met in 1910 as part of the young Brahmo Samaj movement, and he was 17 years old. And this relationship, of course, we know, began as a saga of a lifelong relationship of mutual love, admiration, and respect. Now, from the establishment of Vishwabharati in 1921, for 10 years, till 1931, for 10 years, from the very inception of Vishwabharati, Prashanta Chandra has acted as the secretary of Vishwabharati, joint secretary, along with Rabindranath. So both of them were joint secretaries, and therefore, you know, the relationship of, he was not the statistician then as he is known later. This is an earlier period, and as we already know, as serving as the joint secretary, he came into very close contact with the poet. And of course, his courtship for 7 long years with the daughter of another Brahmo Samaji, very staunch, serious supporter, Herambo Chandra Moitro. His daughter, younger daughter Nirmalkumari, born in 1900, and it continued. And this, after this rather long, complicated courtship, we know that Herambo Chandra did not agree. Why? Because in the end he agreed, but he said, I won't be present in the wedding because you are too liberal. You young people are too liberal Brahmos. So he avoided the wedding, and it took place in the house of, under the mediation of Dr. Neelratan Sarkar, who was the maternal uncle of Prashanta Chandra. And of course, we already know that Rabindranath blessed them, came them. He had a performance that day. He came in the evening with all his followers for the wedding, and that is how, since that day, so since the very beginning, you know, the relationship with Rani developed from the day of their marriage. And the couple, the Mahalanobis couple, played host to them, to Rabindranath, in all the 3-4 different homes in which they stayed. First of all, it was the house of the Alipur Meteorological Office, where Prashanta Chandra also served as the director, apart from teaching at physics at Presidency College. So their official home became Rabindranath's first place of, you know, interaction and staying with the Radha. Then, of course, later in Boranagar, in 2 separate homes of the Mahalanobis, he stayed. One was called Shoshibhila, one was called Gupta Nibash, and of course, the third house, which he had planned, but we could not come, he himself had named, called Amropali. So, but unfortunately, he named the house, but he could not, for his ill health, come to the. So, from the very beginning, because he was part as a secretary, Prashanta Chandra accompanied Rabindranath in all his trips. So, this is the reason. And Rani also accompanied them, and it did not take long for Rani to become part and parcel of the household. She took care of the poet's needs when they were traveling, and for a long time she would spend in Shantiniketan with the poet. Apart from the fact that, from time to time, she suffered a kind of chronic illness which made her travel to the Santal Pargana district to Giridih. The house had a house at Giridih, so she had to go to recover during that period. She had to go frequently. Whenever she was extra sick, she had to go and spend a couple of months at Giridih to recoup. So here, apart from being after her house in Calcutta, absent-minded professor, most of her time she spent with the poet, either at Shantiniketan or at the trips. So this relationship, this coming to close proximity to the poet, is something which comes out very well, and especially in the memoirs. Another reason also, another point was that Rani was childless, and so she could devote more time for the poet. And in 1936, Rabindranath dedicated his poem Shamoli to her. And of course, she survived her husband's death, and she breathed her last only in 1981. But coming to the memoirs, as I told you, one thing we have to remember, memoirs are much different in nature from biography or autobiography, because they are recollections, as you want to remember. So here in Rani's memoirs, Kobir Sange Dakinatte describes, much later though, about the poet's trip to South India and Sri Lanka. Rani tells us chronologically how this began, how she started writing. It so happened that in Shantiniketan one evening, they were all having dinner, and Prashanta Chandra at the dinner table, after dinner conversation, started reminiscing about this trip in South India, where they were accompanied by Andrews. Andrews was a very close friend of Rabindranath, friend and very, reliable kind of an intermediary who used to contact with Gandhi with many issues. But Andrews himself was a part of this trip. And this entire narration is the funny things that this priest, he was a priest by official, so the funny things he did. And after they laughed, the next morning, when the poet asked, I heard you all had a lovely after dinner conversation, what do you all talk about? So they said, Prashanto said that, we were all laughing over the funny things that Andrew did on that trip, South India, and it's hilarious. I don't have the time to go into details. So then the poet said that, why don't you write these down for posterity? Rani says, I cannot write. How can I write? He says, you write letters very well. You like to write long letters. I've seen in the foreign trips, you write huge long letters, very descriptive. So, okay, you do something. You imagine you are writing a long letter to me, and you start writing. That is how her writing of memoirs began much late. And of course, one thing he said, which is he instructed Rani specifically with these words. See, write down everything about that travel. Don't omit anything. You remember everything very clearly, even trivial details. But I forget them very easily. Now I am remembering everything after listening to you. You better start writing them now, otherwise you will forget it later. Don't omit anything, write down everything you remember. So same thing he repeated twice and thrice. So when Rani told him that if she wrote down everything in details, a lot of unnecessary information would creep into the writing. The poet replied, let it be. It won't be bad. It will be a good read. The history of how I wrote Sheshir Kobita will remain. A lot of funny incidents would also remain for people to enjoy them. Don't omit me or you in that writing. These are direct quotes from Rabindranath. Now here I want to tell you that I don't have time to discuss in details, but it is amazing that during this trip to the south, Sri Lanka and South India, to Kunur especially, Rabindranath was simultaneously writing two novels. One was Joga Jog and one was Shesher Kobita, which Rani inspired him to write. And there is detailed description that they were going for a day trip to Ooty and he wanted to just relax in his easy chair in the balcony. Rani forced him, held him, took him to the writing table, gave him a paper and pen and says, write. By the time we come back, I must see that you have written something. And he stood there, she stood there at least when he wrote at least 14 or 15 lines. Then they left for the day trip. And after they came back, Rabindranath said, yes, now I can really, figure out everything. And it is interesting that if you know, Joga Jog and Shesher Kobita fall in two different genres of the poet's writing. How he was simultaneously doing that in the trip, you get a detailed description. And in this narrative, apart, I told you already, there are excellent pen pictures which Rani draws about, how they met Sri Aurobindo at Pondicherry. While they were going, the ship stopped. Then they met Annie Besant and C.F. Andrews was there and many others. And childish nature, I told you of Andrews, hidden behind his serious personality. So in this way, in the end, they went to Bangalore to the house of Rabindranath Chil, and there he completed Shesher Kobita one whole night. They stood behind the door in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock. He wrote the farewell, my friend, He Bondhu Biday, famous Shesher Kobita line, and he was reading out aloud to himself in the middle of the night. And here she was hiding behind the door, not wanting to disturb him and listening to the whole thing. The next morning, the novel was completed on all respects. So what I'm trying to say is, serious critics often, don't take memoirs very seriously. But we find not the scholarly, serious, philosophical poet. We find many intricate details of a poet who was also, close as a domestic person. This is the picture that it was. Now, just a little bit about Kobir Shange Europe. I told you that it tells us it is the only extant details of the 7-month trip, and if there is a long story behind why this writing did not come out. Now, Rabindranath had written a letter in Probashi to Ramananda Chattopadhyay that, the people who accompanied me in the trip did not bother to write anything down. In fact, they had sent all the details. Prashant Chandra had worked extra hard to send all the details, daily reports to Vishwabharati for the publication in the bulletins. But for some strange reasons, the files disappeared. And those who know about the little bit of history is there was a lot of discussion about, Rabindranath taking, the hospitality of Mussolini and then later criticizing fascism, and it turned out that there was this 2 professors, Tucci one and one was Formici, who was always guarding them so that they would give wrong things, reports in the press every morning praising Rabindranath, and how Prashanta Mahalanobis learnt with the Italian dictionary and found out that things that Kobi never said anything were already being publicized by, these Italian press. And so we don't know why, but there were some vested interests. All those reports were never published, lost, and Rabindranath was sick in Berlin, so it was only left with Nirmalkumari and Prashanta Mahalanobis to accompany them in the 7-month-long trip. But after that, when they came back, when Rabindranath was told that no, we had sent papers, he wrote an apology also. I didn't know. And he was told that the reports were already sent. So Rani, what she thought was, since the reports were not there, that she would write down the memoirs. She collected all the letters she wrote to different people back in Kolkata and put them in a file serially so that she could comprise the memoir from that. Now, it is interesting that that file suddenly also got lost from the Vishwabharati office. Later, many years later, it was found in the godown among a heap of papers, and when that file was returned, it was found that all the letters she wrote from Italy were missing from that file. So she writes that I have to reconstruct things after all this period from memory. But at the same time, you find, serious biographers, like even Prof Mukhopadhyay, they all other biographers, whenever they have to talk about Rabindranath's tour to various countries in Europe, they all have to fall back upon Rani's extant Rani's memoir. So whatever you might find it, whether and after Prashanta Chandra left for establishing the ISI 1931, Rani still continued to be in close proximity with the poet, and as I told you, in the end. And she says in the preface to this book that I am fortunate from the letters I got back and from my memory, that most of which I can recollect in details, I could string together and reconstruct a more or less clear picture of what had taken place. If nothing was lost, then this picture could have been much more wholesome and fulfilling. Now, due to serious bouts of illness and other family problems, the writing of the memoir got delayed further, and ultimately this priceless narrative, as I already mentioned, saw the light of day as late as 1969, a long 28 years after the poet's demise. But till date, in spite of several gaps in the narration, this memoir, as I repeatedly say, remains the only extant document of the poet's tour of so many different countries in Europe in 1926. And this is where, when scholars all over the world are talking about, researching about Rabindranath, most of them did not, rather till today, have access to an English version to read what this actual memoir was about. So this was one important thing. And as I already told you, that the Pathe Prante, the 60 letters, Rabindranath selected himself, and out of that we find there is a continuity. And when they parted, when Rabindranath was coming back from Europe, Prashanto wanted to stay back. He stayed back. So they parted ways in a port in Greece. And from there, they continued to stay. He continued to stay in Europe for some more time, and Rabindranath came back alone in the ship. And here he says, this is something from the letter, the first letter of the Pathe Prante, which I say is a continuation, which Rani also quotes in her memoir. As I moved towards my homeland, I kept on continuing our companionship alive through letters. Some of those letters and those written later have now been collected here as the third series of Patradhara. The constant debates going on all around regarding new experiences have been expressed through these letters. But the experience of our European travel which were not expressed anywhere, remains invaluable. Incidentally, as I told you, that Rani, as per Prashanto Pal, the other biographer, he mentions clearly that since Rani suffered a lot from a kind of non-infectious tuberculosis, for her fever was almost a regular affair. So naturally, Rabindranath would get worried. He would go on suggesting different biochemic and homeopathic medicines, and he went on writing innumerable long letters, which, according to the poet, would help Rani to forget some of her physical ailments. So this was also the reason why 500 plus letters the poet wrote in the duration of those 12 years. Now, after reading these memoirs, and as I said, my main intention is not for Bengali readers who can read the original text, but at least to acquaint people with, these other aspects. This is part and parcel of understanding our poet. Now, after reading these memoirs and, the letters, we can really understand a lot of incidents in the poet's life with greater clarity, and also assess many incidents from the point of view of a lady who was as close to the poet as his own daughter-in-law Pratima Devi. Constantly encouraged by her husband to attend to the poet, the meaning of the relationship becomes clear when we remember what Mahalanobis had said. এটা আমি বাংলায় আগে বলছি, আমরা ইতিহাসে রবীন্দ্রনাথকে পাইনি, আমরা বাস্তব জীবনে তাকে পেয়েছি. So we have not got Rabindranath through history, but we have got him in real life. So this is where the importance of these memoirs, in spite of, despising them as women's and writing not chronologically consistent, etc., etc., from critics, it has a special charm of its own. So I think serious academic scholars might argue that Rani's memoirs often lack coherence. They are full of repetitions, and they often highlight personal and trivial incidents of the poet's life which seem irrelevant now. But here one must remember, which I said earlier, that memoirs are an essentially different genre of writing than biography. Memory can never be an uncomplicated, straightforward retrieval of objective data. Memory is always selective and always subjective. It is also a reconstruction which involves a certain amount of fantasy added to fact. And if you are writing so many years later, you are definitely going to fill up with details sometimes which might not have happened that way, but how you remember it. As the details of Rani's memoirs reveal, they were written after a long duration of time, and in spite of repetition, I think this is how she wanted things to be remembered by the readers. Also, reading the narratives observed through an essentially female gaze. This is what I tell you. This is a reading from a domesticated female gaze. It also gives us ample scope of understanding the lighter and domesticated side of Rabindranath Tagore, which is sorely missing in very serious narratives and biographies. So that is that. This was the very nutshell of why I got inspired to do this, not only as a travelogue, not only to fill in the gap, but also as women's writing, as memoir, as recollection. So these are also to be studied seriously, apart from only, scholars constantly talking about nationalism and cosmopolitanism and Tagore's idea of unity, etc. This is also part of stories that are recorded and need to be, disseminated among Tagore speakers, among Tagore lovers, those who want to know more about the intricate details of the poet. The last word I want to say it, the book, I don't know whether can you see that, Shumon? I don't know. The cover you have already displayed.
No, Somdatta, you have to adjust your screen, I think, to reveal.
Anyhow,
Yes, yes.
I just want to mention that our publishers, very young, enthusiastic, my ex-students from Shantiniketan, Birut Jatiyo, they have done a tremendous service and a wonderful job of bringing out this book. And if any of you feel interested, it might sound like a publicity stunt, but you all can get in touch with them and get copy of the book if you like to read it. It has lovely pictures also included in it about the trips. And that is all I wanted to say, and I hope that I could enlighten you a little bit about the relationship of KOBI and Rani in the short duration of my lecture. If you have any questions, queries, I might sound, disjuncted because I wanted to say many things at the same time. I'm ready to answer your queries and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Somdatta very much. Now I would, for your lecture, now I would like to hand over the interactive session to my colleague Ipshita Bhattacharjee, who will be conducting the interactive session, and all the participants are requested to put their questions either in the chat box, or they can, if they want to, they can personally ask Professor Somdatta Mondal. Thank you very much. Ipshita, please.
Thank you for an insightful presentation. Now I would be conducting the interactive session of this webinar. The first question we have is from Ahmed Ashan Uzzaman, Professor, Department of English, Independent University, Bangladesh, Dhaka. His question is, you translated for those who cannot read the works in Bengali original. What strategy you adopted for translation, foreignization, or domestication, or a blend of the two? Ma'am, if you please respond to this.
Well, I don't know what you mean by domesticization. I wanted to make the text as possible technically correct and not deviate from facts, and as readable as possible for the modern reader. I think for translators now, there are so many various strategies they follow about translation, but I wanted to make it as simple and as readable for anyone. So I don't know what you really mean by domesticization or anything. What do you mean by domesticization?
Somdatta, good evening. How are you?
Yes, good evening. Fine.
Okay. What I wanted to know is that, there could be, in the original Bengali, there could be many allusions or ideas which are definitely difficult to translate. And it so happens that when we translate, we try to make it, simple for the target audience. That is, we don't want to keep it, difficult for the readers. So, I mean, this is what this is strategy.
What I have done, especially, this is a part of my translation procedure, that certain very Bengali culture specific words, I have put that, and then the explanation and side by side with it. And this especially, there are several instances where, especially in the two appendix articles which I mentioned, where Rabindranath directly quotes slokas from the Upanishad. So the original Upanishad phrase is there, and then next to it is the Bengali, is the English follow-up, so that my faulty translation would not be, responsible for not understanding what the poet meant. Those who know Sanskrit, I had to take the help of a professor of Sanskrit, my friend, to even understand some of these details, Upanishad slokas. And if you have a look at this, they are put side by side, the shlokas along with the explanation. So same thing with very culture specific words, which the original Bengali is there, and then so it is not that just because it is meant for a non-Bengali audience that I have simplified things. I have kept them as culture specific as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Didi.
Now we have another question from Amit sir himself. He has asked you to elaborate domesticated female gaze.
Not games, it is gaze. I was
Gaze.
talking about the female gaze.
Yes, that's right, gaze.
Yes, ma'am,
Yes.
gaze.
The way of looking and mentioning intricate things that falls, this becomes another very big area of culture studies and translation studies as well, talking about the female gaze, where critics and scholars all agree that the same place, same object, a female viewpoint is obviously different from a male person's point of view. So that is what I meant by the female gaze.
Yes, that's perfectly understood. But if you could just give one or two examples where this female gaze is revealed, just one or two examples, which would, I'm just curious.
No, there are very specific, so many little incidents where the way she narrates things, she narrates jokes and things, which Rani Mahalanobis does, which we could not expect to be written down, if a male person was writing the daily affairs. Just for example, offhand it comes to my mind, one day she said that she went out shopping in Colombo and she came back, and there she bought several little the professor bought several little mementos of elephants, for just souvenirs to give back to people in Calcutta. And she mentions that I sat there on the table, unwrapped all the packing, and I laid down all the different sizes of elephants when KOBI entered the room. And he says, "What are you doing with so many elephants?" So he says that I didn't buy it. The professor bought it to give to friends. So KOBI তখন বললেন, ওই জন্য বুঝেছি তোমাকে কেন এত পছন্দ, তুমি তো একটি হাতি সমান, আরেকটি হাতি অ্যাড হল। This is just one stray example that came into my mind. So these little kinds of things, ওই জন্য কবির এত হাতি পছন্দ। And he would always say, মুখখানা তোমার গোল হয়ে ফুলে পূর্ণ শশীর মতো হয়ে গেল, হ্যাঁ, এত ঘুমাও কেন? মানে these observations, these little intricate details, আমি ওনার জামা ধরে টান দিলাম, আমি ওনাকে একটা গিফট দিয়ে বললাম আমি এটা কিনেছি আপনার জন্য, কিন্তু আপনাকে প্রমিস করতে হবে এটা আপনি কাউকে দিতে পারবেন না, আপনি সবাইকে দান করে দেন জিনিস। মানে so what I mean to say is these little domesticities and the way a woman sees things, they are very minor but they also add to our understanding of the poet and his, and especially Baishe Shrabon, if you read the memoir, they are full of such details. When he was sick, when, as I mentioned in the very first beginning, how he held her hand and says, "Tumi amar shesh diner bondhu, tumi amake promise koro je tumi amar aaj shobai chole gelo, tumi amake chhede jabe na." And then what she feels like, how she narrates things. So these are some things which you would not expect probably from a male person. This is what I have to say. Am I clear?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for answering the questions. Now I would request the convener of our webinar subcommittee, Associate Professor Rima Kanjilal Madam to take over the session for addressing the valedictory speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ishita.